The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Poker is a game played recreationally by millions of people and avidly by thousands. Large tournaments can have thousands of players and offer millions of dollars in prizes to the top finishers. As with sports generally, poker offers some interesting ways to test some propositions from economics. Successful poker players, for instance, must skillfully apply decision-making uncertainty and insights from game theory, two of the areas of economic theory. And in some cases, we can test how frequently players make correct decisions, allowing us to draw a number of inferences about the nature of information in the economy and the likelihood that business investors can see through the lies being spun by fraudsters. Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss how his personal interest in poker has turned into a research interest is Johnson Center Master's student Will Pouncey. Welcome back to the show, Will.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been here. Thanks for having me back.
Well, so let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your interest in poker first, and then we'll talk about how this got to be a research topic.
Yeah, well, really quickly, I've always been interested in strategy games. I think as a young kid, I was really interested in chess, and that was something that I never competed or did anything with that except with friends at school or with my dad or family members, and I think that there was probably sometime in late middle school to early high school somebody brought a poker set to class one day, and it was kind of the last couple days after we'd already taken finals. I remember a couple of days where we just sat there and played poker, and it seemed that I was better than the rest of them. Maybe I was just luckier at that given time period, but it really got me interested in the game because of the strategy element to it, because of all the different strategy profiles that you can take and the way that it changes as you play against different players. And so it's something that's really interesting as someone who is interested in that kind of thing in a way to have kind of that creative outlet and of expression of your different concoctions of strategies, and it's a fun thing to do. It's a fun thing to do with friends, and so it was something that I got really interested in. And then, of course, being an economics student, there are a lot of really great crossovers between the two. I think that as you kind of mentioned in the intro, poker offers a really several different really cool ways that economists can study. We can draw comparisons between markets and poker games. Different variations of poker games have different game theoretical applications, and so there's a pretty cool literature that exists both on the analyzation of poker game theory from an economic perspective and in transferring the game itself as kind of a substitute or a proxy for analyzation of markets. And it gives you a really cool way to, in a much shorter time period, analyze decision making, analyze how people make calculations about profit and loss capabilities and that kind of thing. So there's several cool crossovers, and it's just you can get lost in the research.
Right. Yeah. Well, and we'll be talking about some research that we're actually collaborating on, because although when I was a kid, I never enjoyed playing poker. It just seemed to me not very interesting until all of a sudden, I was in my 30s, and Texas Hold'em. I never, we never played that when I was a kid, but this seemed a lot more fun, a lot more interesting than other forms of poker. So we have a common interest in poker, and there's some research questions we can take a look at it as well. So, before we get started here. There's a larger element. There are a number of different ways you could look at poker to study economics, and one of the importance of them comes from to the extent that poker players, to some extent, are trying to run bluffs on each other, or then they're trying to call these bluffs. And so, we're not going to get into details of the game of poker here, but we do want to talk about this idea that poker sometimes is going to involve bluffing and trying to, as they say, play the other person's cards, not your own cards, right?
Probably has to be one of the most popular ideas, or one of the most well-known things about poker is the idea of bluffing. And I think that when you start looking at literature that exists just about marketplace interactions, like Akerlof's Market for Lemons, when you have two potentially competing parties, where one party has, a desired outcome and the other party has a similar desired outcome, even in situations where there should be collaboration, we can see competition. And so an interesting way to view the game of poker as an inherently competitive game, and a game where that information gap exists, and that's kind of the whole premise, is that you don't know what your opponent's cards are, there's concealed information by nature. That has some really interesting applications, in the marketplace as well. So, like the research from the Market for Lemons. If you have a car that's a lemon and a car that is a peach, but you have a car salesman and he might be trying to sell you either or you might have two separate salesmen, one selling you the lemon, one selling you the peach, and you have no idea of being able to tell which one is which. What that buyer can do is try to make an inference off of the salesmen themselves. Right. So is this person being genuine with me? Is this person lying to me about the status of this car? Because the person that's selling the peach, in this framework is not telling, or excuse me, the person selling the lemon is not telling you, hey, this car doesn't run. When you get 5 miles off the lot, it's going to break down on you. They're telling you, hey, this is a great car. Look at the air conditioning. This is so great. There's an element of being able to see through that. And so there's another paper, The Cost of Faking Smiles, where they analyze in what would be a collaborative situation when you have two separate payoffs where if we collaborate, we can have a greater payoff, and if you choose not to collaborate, there can be a lower payoff. But there has to be trust placed on the part of the other person. Am I able to, by smiling at you or really convincing you that, hey, I'm genuine and I'm going to hold your interests, in account, can we cut down on those transactions costs of that interaction and be able to reach the higher payoff? And I'm sure I'm getting a little bit more into the technicalities now, but the whole idea is that we have this informational gap. And how do we fill that informational gap? Can I express to you that, yes, I'm going to hold up my word, or this is in fact a good car, and can you trust that? Or if I'm lying to you, can you see through that? Right. And that's something that we're able to test in poker. If they're clearly bluffing, if the story that they are telling says, I have a very strong hand, I'm going to beat you, but that is in fact not the case, and that person is able to see through that, then that's something that we can infer about people's abilities to read other players and get a sense for what is the truth actually.
Yeah, and this is really important because, when we're modeling the market for used cars, we were sort of assuming that if somebody's got a bad used car, they can simply say, this is a great used car,
exactly.
and that those words are cheap, and they can simply lie, and people won't be able to tell that they're lying. But if poker players can, for instance, read through and see through people's bluffs, then this would be some evidence that would be relevant for other economic contexts.
Exactly.
And in many ways, there's also applications to financial markets, right?
Oh, absolutely. As we have pictured here on the right, Bernie Madoff, he was able to convince, many prominent people, very intelligent people, that he was in fact a great investor, and in fact he was just running a giant Ponzi scheme. And that's something that is really interesting when you look and you see, you have this charismatic character who was able to invoke a great deal of trust when in fact he was in no way providing the services that he said that he was. And then and sort of on the opposite side, but almost for a different reason, we have Warren Buffett pictured on the left. He's well known for the incredible business deals he's been able to do, and more so kind of his unconventional methods. I've read many stories about Warren Buffett just walking up into somebody's office unannounced to see, well, what are they? He has a famous story about how he decided to invest in Burger King, it's because he walked into their office and he really liked the way that things were set up and the way that they were operating. And so he was able to look beyond just, the financial reports and the three statements and looking, at their numbers. And he was able to see, okay, how are these people going to be able to perform this job? And then when in dealings with people, he's well known for having kind of that radar, that alarm bell that goes off when something isn't right. And that, if you listen to some of his interviews about his dealings through the financial crisis, you can really see, he did a great job of identifying who were the people that were selling the lemons and who were the people that were selling the peaches.
Yeah, and then he's famous for not wanting to invest in a company until he gets to actually go in and meet the people face to face. Because it seems like he feels he's got an ability to, detect bluffs pretty well. And
I would say the market's proven that.
And we could certainly say that the market would have worked a lot better if people could have read through Bernie Madoff's bluff and seen that he was pulling a scam on them. So. Again, the kinds of decisions poker players are making are of the same kinds of things that we see, maybe in the investment world or other areas in economics. So, we want to have some, want to look to see what the available evidence is, and do poker players make correct decisions. Now, in order to do that, we actually have to find some places where we could actually go out and find some data. And so, one of the things we do, we're going to look at tournaments and televised tournaments particularly, because that helps us a lot in terms of knowing whether somebody's got the best hand, right?
This is where it gets fun, and thanks to you, we have an incredible data set of World Poker Tour hands that took place over 8 seasons of the televised World Poker Tour. And so to get to that, there's a lot of variation in between one game of poker and another game of poker. So if you and your friends sit down and you're just playing a game at the kitchen table, or if you go to a casino and sit down and play in a cash game, or if you're watching a televised World Series of Poker or World Poker Tour event, no two of those poker games are the same, right? So as far as the game theory is concerned, there's going to be different considerations in cash games or in tournaments, or even in, there's going to be more of a meta game with people that more and that kind of thing. What our data set is able to do is it's able to look at really high profile tournaments. So tournaments where there's a lot of prestige on the line, there's a lot of money on the line. Also, we're through, hundreds, if not thousands, of entrants that have already been eliminated. And so in many cases, and something that's really interesting is we tend to see a lot of the same names popping up at these final tables. So out of pools of hundreds, if not thousands of players, you're seeing a lot of the same top tier players that are getting in, while of course it's not always going to be the best players that end up making the final table, but that says something in and of itself. But our data set is almost unique in the sense that there's less of the when you're actually making a decision, when somebody makes a bet and I'm deciding after everything else is done, do I have the best hand or do I have the worst hand? There's less of the total game considerations to take into account. So if I'm playing in a cash game, I have to worry about, if I fold this hand, maybe he's going to be relentless against me, in the future. Less of that is a concern because of the high-profile nature of this tournament, the fact that there are millions of dollars on the line, and that each individual decision is much, much more important. So one wrong decision or one right decision can make a great difference here. So what we're able to say with this is we can be less concerned with the game theory aspect of poker and more concerned with a player's ability on an individual in one case when he's facing a decision, being able to discern through all of the information and make either the right decision or the wrong decision. And so there's going to be less of that concern for, if I fold here, then he's just going to bluff against me relentlessly.
And so we were specifically looking at the different games with these. This is all Texas Hold'em, and then we're looking at the point in time in a hand where all the cards are dealt. So there are no more cards to come. So there, and that's important because when you think about the theory of poker, it's hard to criticize somebody if they're calling, they don't have a very good hand, but they're drawing to a straight or a flush. The fact that their hand might improve, so the fact that they don't currently have the best hand, we can't really characterize that as, quote, a mistake.
Sure.
But after all the cards are dealt out there, we know who's got the better hand. We know in part also because of this being televised poker, they have these hole cams, and that's that was a big technological innovation just in and of itself to make televised poker a lot more interesting, because you actually know what the players have, and you can see if they're bluffing or not. But so the game theory gets very complicated. Other than if we pick out these, like end of the hand decisions, and then in this situation where the players want to win these tournaments, and even though they're some of these players are professionals and they win and lose millions of dollars all the time, there's a lot of prestige that comes with winning one of these tournaments. And so near the end of the tournament, even if the money doesn't matter all that much to them, they might turn around and lose that money in the next day or something like that. And, they still have that prestige, and so there's still a strong value in trying to win the tournament, right?
Exactly, and that's why we place such an importance on that final decision as we define it in the paper. Like you said, you did a good job of explaining that. After all the cards have been dealt, and I'm now facing a decision that closes the action, there's not going to be anything else that happens afterwards. Am I able to make the right call or the right fold, or am I incorrect? And like you said, because of the prestige on the line, because of the fact that especially these professional players, they want to beat the other professionals. They play with them every single day. They've probably won and lost, like you said, millions of dollars back and forth between the lot of them. They want to be the one holding up the trophy at the end of it. Or at least we can assume that there is more of that in these instances than there would be otherwise.
And even though you might normally say something like, "Oh man, I would never fold this really strong hand," if you're convinced the other player's got a better hand, and it's in this tournament format near the end of the tournament, if you make the wrong call, you could lose the tournament with one wrong call. So if anything, there should be heightened emphasis on getting these decisions right in this case, right?
And I think with this data set, as much as you can find in the game of poker where the theory is more discounted and there's more emphasis placed on, like you said, being correct on this instance, I think that this gives us the best opportunity to look at that.
And poker authors like this gentleman, David Sklansky, he's clearly drawn a lot of game theory. So it's also sort of cool as a professor teaching game theory. You can see like, there's all these game theory notions being applied here in poker. So it's good in that sense to see like at least somebody's putting our game theory to work.
That's true. That is true.
So. There's one other thing that could throw a wrench in this, though, because even like if a poker player has some ability to try to see through a bluff, if you're tricky enough, then it can be really hard to read somebody, right?
For sure, and this gets to and people that are watching are probably, well, why is there a soccer game up? But it gets to the theory of having a mixed strategy. And so in any game theory, if you're able to properly implement a mixed strategy, then you're unpredictable. And as the reason that we have the soccer game up is that there's some great research that's been done on free kicks, and how when you have player kickers that are able to effectively mix their strategy of deciding, okay, do I place the ball up the middle, to the left side, to the right side, and they don't have a predictable, where, they favor this side more often than not, then the goalies have a much more difficult time of blocking those kicks. And it's a pretty intuitive concept that, if you are more unpredictable, then you're going to be harder to stop. And so that's something that, if you have good players that are effectively mixing their strategies, and, they are putting more emphasis on that, the game theory side of it, then it is going to be more difficult to make the correct decisions off of them, unless, like we got to earlier, unless that they have some live tells where, I can see, his heart's beating faster, or, he glanced this way. And there is some element of that you have to consider when you're playing, in live poker. But we have to be able to account for some of that variation and saying that we're going to have good players that are, effectively mixing their strategies. So
Right.
we're not going to see highly polarized results where players are right almost all of the time or wrong almost all of the time.
Yeah, that's just something to keep in mind as we get to these results. We don't, and especially if it's the case that pros are going to be better at mixing. They're mixing up their strategies. They're
Sure.
not doing the same thing all the time, not falling in any kind of recognizable, predictable patterns. Then they should be even harder to try to put on a hand or try and figure out what they have. So, tell us then a little bit about the data that we have and what are some of your results.
So like I said, the data was across 8 seasons of the World Poker Tour, which was meticulously notated, as I'm sure that you're well aware. And so, as you can see, what we looked at was just the hands that made it to the river, where there was a player made a bet, and now we're analyzing the decision of the player who's deciding either to call or to fold. For this, we factored out the raises because that kind of opens up a different question. So we're looking at decisions where a player was going to call or going to fold and whether they were correct or not. And so out of those 8 seasons, we had 407 observations, and what I've done, or what we did, was break it into kind of these different sections where we have matchups. And so we see how did the pros fare against the entire field, and then how do they fare against the amateurs or against the other professionals.
Okay.
And so you can look and see, the pros fared slightly better against the field than the amateurs did. 52% to 50.9. Like you said, there's going to be a lot of that variation there, and of course, in that field, you're factoring in, the professional players. And then you see pros versus pros are about 50-50, which seems to suggest that people are effectively mixing. And then the one data point that's a little bit odd is you see the pros versus amateurs. And so pros were making correct decisions at a greater rate against the fellow professionals than they were against the amateurs. And I kind of have an idea of how you can explain some of this away, in that, these professional players all know each other, and they have more information on the play styles and the tendencies of their fellow professionals, whereas a lot of these amateurs are more wild cards. They find their way into the final table, and they're probably good players. They have to have at least some kind of, fundamental structure of playing the game, or they wouldn't have made it to that point. But they're relatively unknown. People don't have a whole lot of information on how they play. And so, given that poker is a game of trying to discern incomplete information, that's going to make it more difficult over a shorter, selection. So,
and one thing to know, that even if it is an amateur, these tournaments last for several days, and it's quite possible that they've played, even if they've never played a tournament against this player before or played in a casino against them, they might well have seen them, been at the same table as one of the other last final players at some point in this tournament. So they've probably seen a little something.
There will be some of that crossover. I think that probably the most profound results that we got just from the simple analysis was amateurs against the pros made a correct decision about 44% of the time, where amateurs fared much better against other amateurs, making the correct decisions well over half, about 55% of the time. So what we see is that amateurs are having a much more difficult time against pros, which is relatively intuitive. The pros are doing a better job of mixing, and they're probably going to play the amateurs a little bit tougher.
And just to be clear here, it might seem like, well, how is somebody might be thinking, it's like, how is it that the pros do poorly against amateurs, and yet the amateurs also do poorly against pros? This is coming down to a final decision where it's a pro making a decision, and we can characterize their decision.
Exactly.
And then it's different decisions that amateurs would be making about whether they made the correct decision or not. So
yeah, and just to clarify,
it's not the flip side of the same decision.
Sure. Yeah. The decision maker in this case is the one who's presented with the information and has to try and see through, is this person bluffing me or are they not?
Right. Now, if we dive a little deeper into this, there are a number of factors that might be affecting whether somebody's likely to make a correct call or not, and one of them depends on the strength of the hand. And we're not going to get into talk about much detail about which hand beats that? Because if those who only casually play poker probably never remember that stuff. Anyway,
Yeah.
But the point is that a skilled poker player will have a good sense of how strong of a hand they have, and that's going to affect their whether they're going to make a correct call, right?
Absolutely. And so what we had to do with the regression analysis was break it into two separate pieces, where we're analyzing correct and incorrect calls and correct and incorrect folds, because the strength of somebody's hand is going to increase the likelihood that you make a correct call. If I have a very strong hand and you make a bet, even if I think, well, maybe there's one hand out there that is better than mine, my hand is just so strong that I just can't fold it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be more biased towards calling. Whereas if I make a correct fold, but my hand was very, very weak, I didn't have anything. I didn't have a hand that could possibly call and hope to beat you. Then it's going to be very, very easy for me to make that fold. So in doing the regression analysis, we had to control for that. Just did a simple 1 to 10 rank of hand strength, where something like a royal flush, an unbeatable hand would be a 10, and then something like a 7 high or something would be a 0. And so that was really important for this analysis, because of the fact that there's going to be such a bias towards one side or the other if you have a very, very strong hand or a very, very weak hand.
Right. Yeah. And almost the really interesting stuff is going to be in the middle there. Exactly. With those hands that maybe they could be good, maybe they could be a winner, and maybe they could be a loser. There's some other things that would matter here as well, and that might be like things like the size of the bet that somebody's going to make, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of the same story with that. If there's a larger bet size, if they bet 100,000 instead of 50,000, then it's going to be more difficult for me to make that call. So if I'm on the call side, then it's going to be, all else equal, it's going to be more difficult when they make a bigger bet. And we can see that in the game theory, with the pot odds that you're getting. I mean, it's very well known. Same on the fold side. If I'm facing a very large bet, it's going to be easier for me to make a correct fold. And so you have to control for those kinds of things when you're doing regression analysis, so that you don't, so that you're picking up actually what you really want to see. And like you said, it's those things in the middle, it's those ones in the middle, they're going to be the most interesting.
And just another factor even is just the number of players in a hand at the start of the hand, because that, again, the odds tell you something about like how good the strongest hand is likely to be in a situation like that. Right?
Even just thinking about it very simply, if everybody just turned their cards up and you ran the board out, you're more likely to win if there's only 2 players in the hand than if there's 3 or 4 or 5.
Well, and so I really think that that this is an interesting project. And that there's probably some more we can analyze as well. I mean, there has been some there's some very interesting things in the poker world in terms of people making deals with one another and backing players. And there's a lot of stuff there that's very similar to some of the stuff what we see in finance, right?
Absolutely.
Or business startups, right?
There's really cool things, all from analyzing entrepreneurship through this lens and those the decision making process there of trying to estimate what payoffs are, down to things like prisoners' dilemmas that we see in satellite structure tournaments. There are all kinds of really cool applications that you can make from poker in its different formats to finance and economics.
Well, thanks for coming on and talk about this. This has been very enjoyable. We've talked a lot about this project
I wish we had more time.
over the last few months, but it's been a lot of fun, and there's some more work I think for us to do.
Absolutely.
On this. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.